Thanks, Lily. Appreciate that. I'm Pamela Webb from the University of Minnesota, and I have the pleasure, along with Jim Luther from Duke University, of moderating today's panel. We think that obviously this is everybody's favorite topic right now. And so we are just delighted to have this amazingly strong federal panel joining us today to help us with their perspective on this topic. It's probably the fastest moving topic around, and we're going to be spending quite a bit of time today telling you what the latest things are relative to this particular topic. Next slide. So we just wanted to put in the description for you for the overall topic, and go on, so you'll have it for reference purposes. Next slide. So we're going to do some brief introductions here, and Jim and I are just going to give you a very few brief introductory remarks and context for this, but we want to spend the bulk of our time today with our federal panelists and take full advantage of the fact that they were able to join with us today. At the end of the time, we've also left quite a bit of time for a moderated discussion with Q&A. So as Lily said at the top of the hour, if you have questions, please go ahead and put them in the Q&A, not the chat, but the Q&A, and we will gather those up and be answering questions for all of the panelists at the end of the session. Next slide. So with us today, we have two representatives from NSF, Rebecca Kaiser for the Chief of Research, Security and Strategy and Policy for NSF, the inaugural holder of that role. And of course, our ever popular friend, Gene Feldman, joined by our equally popular friend, Michelle Bowles from NIH. And we're also extremely grateful to have Bindu Nair, who's joined us several times in the past to be able to give the DoD perspective on these topics. We have nearly 600 people on today. And so we're anticipating a very lively discussion and engagement of the group on this topic. Next slide. So here's what we're not going to talk about today, basically. But we did want to tell you, I think most people know that FDP has a Foreign Influence Working Group, or FIG, that we've called it for short. And we've been meeting every month and talking about foreign influence topics that have come up during the preceding month. We've been looking at the PAP guide and the planned release of that, trying to keep up with the NIH notices and changes as it relates to foreign influence on those as well. And of course, all of the kind of emerging reports and legislation that is coming out of the federal government. But we've decided today not to dwell so much on those. We've reported to you on those in the past, although Rebecca is going to talk about implementation of the Presidential Memorandum 33. We talked at the January meeting about what FIG was doing with Connect the Dots, and Jim's going to give us a brief reprise of that, as well as our latest thought exchange when you all shared your thoughts with us about topics in foreign influence that are of greatest concern to you. But before we do that, I want to just give you a brief, next slide, a brief indication of what's happening the very latest. And this is really kind of top of desk type of things. The Senate is actually in the process of debating right now new regulation, new law for United States Innovation and Competition Act. So you may have heard about the Endless Frontier Act, and that's actually a subsection, a subpart of this act. But this is a tremendously broad piece of legislation that has, I understand at this point, more than 400 different amendments that are all in different stages of being considered and reviewed. It's moving very quickly. The Senate is actually hoping to act on this by Memorial Day. So these debates are going on right now. So Jim and I particularly wanted to encourage you to please watch the news. Please talk to your federal relations officers, because they are likely to have the very latest information on what is happening with this act. but I did pull out a few things that you might want to be particularly aware of. So one is the possibility for the Department of Ed foreign gift and contract reporting threshold to be lowered from $250,000 to $50,000. One segment of the Act talks about that possibly happening only for certain countries. So we're not really sure at this point whether that change would occur or not if the legislation is passed. There's also a possibility of requiring that any institution that has $5 million or more in research expenditures, that we'd be obligated to ourselves maintain a database to track foreign gifts and contracts that regardless of amount, so any amount of money we'd have to keep track of. There's also a part that said we would potentially need to have the Committee on Foreign Investment in the US pre-review any foreign gifts or contracts over $1 million and there's about 700 of those that come from certain countries. And that would be apparently before we would be able to accept those at our institutions. Another amendment of the bill calls for 3 separate security agencies to establish screening procedures for anyone receiving federal funding from NSF, NIST, or DOE. And so that would be all of our faculty researchers, is my understanding of if that amendment were to go into place. There's also a potential prohibition for foreign talent recruitment programs, but only for certain countries. And those countries that have been named so far are China, Iran, North Korea, and Russia. So that's a possibility. And then where I think many of us are familiar now with the DOE Directive 142.3b, but there's a potential to actually do an outright ban for nationals of a country at risk through that process. And because of the way that wording is described, it's possible that that would include not only foreign nationals, but also lawful permanent residents. So I think you can see from this, and there are other, as I said, other amendments that are possibly being considered as well for this, including one, if we have to do that counterintelligence screening that you see there, that the funding for that would have to come from NSF and from a proposed new directorate at NSF. So that would obviously impact the ability of NSF to fully engage with that new directorate that is being proposed for them to stand up. So the consequences here are very significant and very broad, but it's very difficult at this stage to know which of these amendments is actually going to be put forward, and of course whether the Senate will actually even advance the entire bill for House consideration. So we don't know, but I think the real takeaway here is that the Congress is very much, very actively interested in this topic. And it's possible that some of this legislation will go through so quickly that it will be a challenge for us to help Congress understand the implications of what has been proposed. So I recommend that you stay tuned for all of that. Next slide. Jim, you want to talk about Connect the Dots?
Great, thanks, Pamela. So you all have seen this graphic before. This is kind of a fundamental contextual document that we probably created a year and a half or 2 years ago, but it's been expanded quite a bit. And it's something that the Foreign Influence Working Group has lots of discussion about as we think through the appropriate reporting to the agencies in our collaborations. And the idea here is that the red elements are the dots and the green boxes are where we often have to report those things. And all of it is about what's in the middle, right? How do we do appropriate, transparent reporting to protect national security, protect economic security, and the integrity of research, including overlap and capacity and all the other things that the people, the agency and the people on this call care about. So we bring this up just as a reminder that this is what institutions are struggling with, and it's certainly a friendly reminder to our federal friends as well, because as we look at change management and technology and resources, to do this. It certainly is a heavy lift, as you all know. Next slide, please. Very briefly, and we discussed this in the January 21 discussion, and I won't go into detail because you can pull those slides back up. But if you remember, for each one of these, we had one slide on what the issue is and one slide on considerations of maybe things that that institutions or the partnership between us and our federal partners need to appreciate so that we can do this more effectively. And these will be themes that we as universities talk about, but it's also things that impact the federal partnership in so many ways. Next slide. So, and next slide. So we did another thought exchange. We did this to get input from you all. We had a great response. We probably had someone in the neighborhood of 150 to 175 responses. This slide is here for posterity. It just kind of explains the context of the thought exchange. Next slide. And then this was the question. So, you know, what are the things that are the most pressing concerns for you as an institution? Next slide. And for those of you that didn't do it, there were 4 kind of preamble questions that asked, are you a public research institution, a private research institution, and so forth? What is your role? And do you have an academic medical center? And so this is just a quick summary to show we had about, at this point when I selected the data, about 134 individuals that contributed 114 thoughts, that's the top left. And then these individuals went in and rated those thoughts. And this just enables them to do it in an unbiased way and identify from their perspective what are the most critical things. And then over on the right-hand side, you can see it's the majority of the respondents were public research institutions. As you go to the bottom right, it's about 50-50 between those that have an academic medical center and those that don't. And then as you look at the role of the administration, you can see most of them are administrators, although in the newer data that's yet to be updated, we have a broader faculty response. And what's neat about this thought exchange is we can slice and dice the data based on all these criteria. So we can show me the faculty and public research institutions that do not have an academic medical center, and we can cull down into what are the things that are most critical to them. Next slide. 2 more quick slides, and then Rebecca, I'm going to turn it over to you. This is a word cloud that's automatically generated by Thought Exchange. And as you can see on the bottom right, the word size is the frequency, and the word color is related words. So so purple represents those groups of words that were most commonly in the same thought or group of thoughts. And frankly, this is not materially different than 6 months ago. Harmonization, agency consistency, definitions, those types of things were very much the theme 6 months ago, very much the theme today. I think the one thing we'll talk about in a moment that was probably a slightly higher proportion was discussion about burden and confusion. Next slide, please. This is my final slide, and very briefly, I won't go through all these, but we can talk about the best way to kind of circulate this data, because I think for the agencies, providing you a little bit more detail might be helpful, but there were clear themes about definitions and processes that it would be preferred that they're consistent across institutions. You've heard that before. In the middle section about burden, there is some concern that it is the central sponsored projects office responsibility to make sure all of this is correct, and concerns about the timeliness of submission of proposals and just in time, and how do we get those things done, meet the deadlines, support the faculty, and are still transparent. And I think that is all I'll say right now, just in the interest of time, because we're running a minute or 2 late. So Rebecca, I'd like to turn it over to you for the first set of comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jim. And it's a pleasure to talk to you all. So if I could have the next slide, please. I'm going to be talking to you about research security at NSF, and then, as Jim said, I'm also going to be touching on some interagency efforts as well. Next slide, please. Research security. I think you all know from what you've seen regarding policy and draft legislation that certainly research security is on many minds these days, the minds of policymakers, the minds of researchers, and the minds of us as funders. So we want to make sure, of course, that we protect our open research ecosystem. And you can see this first bullet here. I've actually very carefully worded it, and I've changed the wording from previous presentations. I used to say that we want to balance openness with security. Well, it's really not a balance because it's not an either or. It's a matter of the fact that we want to maintain this open research environment. We all want that. It's what's made us successful. It's how research works, and we want to make sure it continues. And the way that we can do that is by protecting the research ecosystem itself. And what that means is protecting what underpins it, protecting this openness, protecting the transparency, protecting merit-based competition, and protecting our right to innovate. So we want to make sure that we also maintain our commitment to collaboration. I still hear quite a bit that many researchers are concerned about international collaborations. They're concerned that they may get in trouble if they do collaborate internationally. And I want to assure you that international scientific collaboration has been and still is a main part of how we work together and how we do science. And we at NSF encourage it. There's a difference between, and I'll show you a slide, between beneficial principled international collaboration, which is transparent and open, and we all know what everyone is doing, and this improper foreign government interference that we're concerned about. So we want to make sure that we always focus on openness and transparency and reciprocal collaboration. Next slide, please. International collaboration, right? We're transparent. We have reciprocal exchanges for mutual benefit. This doesn't necessarily mean that we contribute the same amount of funding. It might be different in different circumstances, but we all know what we're contributing and we all know how we're benefiting from it. And everybody can benefit from the collaboration. There was a case, a university came to me and they said that for one of their researchers who was on an NSF grant, and so it was out in the public that they were on this NSF grant, and they had an international entity approach the researcher. And the entity said, this sounds really interesting what you're working on for NSF. We want to contribute funding to it, and therefore we would like our researchers to join you on the project. The researcher, in looking at the entity, couldn't really trace where that entity's funding was really coming from. There didn't seem to be very much information about the entity at all. And it also wasn't clear what the qualifications were of the researchers who would join this person on the project. And so the researcher said no. And I think that makes a lot of sense. It wasn't clear what the collaboration, what benefit that collaboration would bring. And so, of course, we also want to leverage complementary skills. We want to know what those skills are, what the facilities are, sites and resources. And again, this is beneficial. Now, improper foreign government interference is contrary to these values and interests. And often it happens through particular foreign government talent recruitment programs. There are many different talent recruitment programs and many that are beneficial. Every country, of course, wants great talent to come to them and work in their country. There are some foreign government talent recruitment programs with contracts that compel the researcher to disregard intellectual property rights, that compel non-transparency, and that breach research integrity. And those are the ones that we're concerned about. We're learning more and more about these contracts. Some are out there in the public. If anyone would like examples, we do have examples that we can send. Next slide, please. What are the challenges that we're worried about? We're worried about conflicts of interest. We're worried about undisclosed duplication and undisclosed commitments to research entities outside of the US employer. Note that I say commitments outside the US employer. These might be commitments that are elsewhere in the US that are not disclosed. They might be international commitments. We do need to know about all of them, and the US employer, meaning the US institution, should know about all of them if that is part of the US institution's rules. And so we need to understand the amount of time, the capacity, and the other sources of research commitment that a researcher has so that we could make good funding decisions. And that needs to be based on the complete information that we have. If a researcher, when we only can give out 20% to 20% of the proposals that we receive, we can only fund that amount because of the funding that we have. And we then give a researcher funding and his institution or her institution funding, and it's based on inaccurate or incomplete information, that just is not fair. And then it's also hard for us to trust that research itself because there were all these other undisclosed commitments. We also, of course, want to make sure that our merit review system is sound, that the proposals that are submitted to us, the researchers have confidence that that information is going to stay with us while it's being reviewed. And of course, we don't want pre-publication data and information to be used unless the principal investigator and the co-principal investigator are comfortable releasing those data. Next slide, please. So we're doing many things. Of course, you know that NSF personnel and rotators at NSF cannot participate in foreign government talent recruitment programs as defined in our policy. That we created my position, the Chief of Research Security Strategy and Policy, and we've developed research security training for all NSF employees, and we're almost finished with specialized training for NSF program officers and grants officials so that everybody is on the same page regarding what to look for, how we use information, and the process that we can go through if information is discovered and if anybody has concerns about that information. We are updating the proposal and awards policy and procedures guide, and Jean will tell you more about that. Mike Lauer from NIH and I co-chair a research security education and training working group. And we're working together to create research security training for the external community. We intend to post modules on the web for anyone to access to talk even more about what we mean by research security, disclosure best practices, international collaboration best practices, and many other aspects. So look out for that. And of course, we continue to communicate with you all, and we will continue to communicate with you all. Next slide, please. I wanted to talk a bit about the National Security Presidential Memorandum 33, NSPM 33, which is about research security. It was finalized in February of 2021. It is in effect now. And through our Research Security Subcommittee of the National Science and Technology Council, we're working on implementation. Okay? So it establishes agency and department roles and responsibilities and outlines specific actions and is more clear, I believe, about what researchers must disclose to organizations or agencies when seeking federal funding. There are a couple of things in the NSPM I wanted to point out that we're working on specifically. One is there's a requirement to further harmonize among funding agencies regarding our requirements. And Jean and Michelle Bowles from NIH are co-chairing a working group on this harmonization. So we're taking it to heart, that big harmonization word in the word cloud. and there's going to be more coming on that. The second thing that we're working on and thinking through is this requirement for digital persistent identifiers, to consider them. And that's something that we're thinking through quite a bit. That's something, as you can imagine, needs to be coordinated with OMB, and of course will then be part of consultative process with you all. The third thing that I wanted to mention is, I know you all saw the requirement for any institution receiving $50 million or more in federal funding to establish a research security program. We understand that there are a lot of questions about what that means. And so we're talking through that in the Research Security Subcommittee. There has already been an options paper developed on implementation of that requirement, on ways it could potentially be implemented, that then will be coordinated with you all in the community to determine what's doable and what's best to do that. Okay, next slide, please. So we're going to continue to work through my team. Right now, I have a very small team. I hope to have more, because we want to even better understand what the risks are in this realm and how to mitigate them. And of course, we have to work with you to better understand what we all can do and how we need to work together to mitigate these risks. We're piloting a risk assessment tool that uses AI and machine learning to better understand what might be going on in research security, the scale and scope of non-disclosures of information that we require, and then what to do about it. And I want to assure you that the what to do about it means consulting with you all on what to do about it. We know that there are many reasons that could have caused non-disclosure, and I want to assure you we're not going to jump to conclusions and jump to automatically thinking that there is any kind of concerning activity going on. We need to better understand what's going on in the community and go from there. We're going to be working on the implementation of NSPM 33, and of course, hear from and work with you. So I'll stop there and I'll turn to Jean, who really has the meat of what we're talking about, what we're doing at NSF. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Rebecca. Next slide, please. Oh, no, you have a conclusion slide.
Sorry, let me finish very quickly. Please do collaborate internationally. It's encouraged, and it's a very important part that we and you both have roles to play in research security. You have to partner together, and please disclose. And that's going to help us greatly. Thank you.
So thank you all very much. I definitely, I had a medical procedure this morning, so I'm not looking my best. So I hope they keep it focused on Rebecca, because my picture isn't available. I'm very delighted to be here to discuss our disclosure policies and procedures in the PAP guide. For those of you that attended my NSF update session, I kept alluding to some very wonderful things in this space that we want to tell you about. I can tell you right here and now, though, that we had posted the document in the Federal Register for 60 days. We received lots of comments and we resolved those comments. However, the document is still currently at the Office of Management and Budget for their review and clearance. So I can only talk about things at the proposed level and will not, unfortunately, be able to get into as much detail as I'd like. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to talk about the proposed enhancements to our biographical sketch coverage. Obviously, as I mentioned in my NSF update, we are proposing to increase the page limitation from 2 to 3 pages. And as I mentioned there, the very big emphasis there is to ensure that an individual has adequate space to identify all of their appointments as specified in the guidance. This is very important that you do so. And both our Office of the Inspector General and the community made it very clear that the 2 pages was simply not long enough. So we believe that this will be a very big help in addressing that issue. We also have added contextual information about all of the proposal sections into the PAP guide. And why this is so critically important is that we at NSF believe greatly in the concept of transparency and letting you know what kinds of information you submit and how it will be used. And so, as has been mentioned many times, the biographical sketch is used to assess how well qualified the individual team or organization is to conduct the proposed activities. And so when we say that's the purpose, that is the purpose of that information. We've also incorporated some frequently asked questions into the full text. And that's been really important based on the feedback that faculty and other senior personnel have given to us as well, particularly regarding what we mean by professional appointments and what types of professional appointments must be included and identified in the biographical sketch. And so we put out an FAQ, and that language has been incorporated into the PAP guide, and it states, with regard to professional appointments, senior personnel must identify all current domestic or foreign professional appointments outside of the individual's academic, professional, or institutional appointments at the proposing organization. And I think that there was great concern that without putting parameters around that, that could end up being very long in terms of what an individual has to report. We've also, not necessarily related to this topic, but one of longstanding at NSF, was the concept of ensuring that all authors for a publication were identified. And as we know, for many publications, and some in particular can go into the hundreds, we listened to the concern you expressed, and now we put what was in an FAQ, senior personnel that wish to include publications in the product section of the biographical sketch that include multiple authors may, at their discretion, choose to list one or more of the authors and then et al. In lieu of including the complete listing of author names. We know that that will address an issue and concern that we have heard many, many times over from the community. We also, and this is one area where I greatly wish we had received the clearance from the Office of Management and Budget, because we have incorporated a reference to a new disclosure table, which is entitled NSF Pre-Award and Post-Award Disclosures relating to the biographical sketch and current and pending support that's been developed to assist users in completion of this section of the proposal. And literally, the document talks about a type of activity, such as in-kind contributions that support the research activity for use on the project being proposed. And across the top are categories: the biographical sketch, current and pending support, facilities, equipment, and other resources, project reports, our post-award term and condition, and then a final category called disclosure not required. And so I believe that that will be extremely useful for all of you in understanding in a very clear way what NSF's expectations are regarding the disclosures in the biographical sketch, as well as in current and pending support. Next slide, please. So these are, again, the proposed enhancements to the current and pending support coverage. The concept, however, is still very clear. Rebecca Kaiser's all means all continues to remain intact. But we also have added as I stated for the biographical sketch, the addition of the contextual statement regarding purpose of current and pending support information. And why I think that's so important, because in the foreign influence, in the FIG, I hadn't heard that particular acronym until today, there were questions to us of, well, I know what you say, but is that really what you use the information for? And yes, indeed, it is. We used current and pending support to assess the capacity of the individual to carry out the research as proposed, as well as to help assess any potential overlap or duplication with the project that's being proposed. We've also have enhancement of coverage regarding reporting of in-kind contributions not being used on the project being submitted, specifically and very importantly, that there must be a time commitment associated with that in order for you to have to report that information. So stay tuned to look at the specific language there. Incorporation of FAQs, like we did in the biographical sketch, we tried to say, hey, we have some FAQs out there. They continue to come in even though we have FAQs. So it's clear that we need to make some of these points in the full text of the language in the PAP guide. Movement of examples of current and pending support. What I mean by that is that we thought everyone had understood that when we say this support includes, for example, federal, state, local, foreign, public or private foundations, nonprofit organizations, industrial or other commercial organizations, or internal funds allocated towards specific projects, that you basically already knew what we meant there, all means all, and so we moved it to a footnote. We've continued to get questions. Do you really mean foreign when you say that we have to report all? Yes, so we've moved up all of those examples right back to the full text. And probably for me personally and for the policy office in general, because we see all of the questions that come into policy at nsf.gov every single day, we've incorporated information to really explain the difference between what is stated on an NSF budget and current and pending support. And let me say just a little more about that. The question often goes something like this. I don't have any time that I'm requesting on the budget, so that's zero. So that means you don't want me to report this. And we're going now, but wait a minute, let's take a step back here. The budget is how much you are requesting for compensation from NSF should that project be funded. What we want on current and pending support is how much time you're going to spend on that project. And those are distinctly different. How much, again, you're requesting from NSF in the way of compensation versus tell us how much time you think it will really take you to complete the scope of work that you're proposing to do. Next slide, please. Additional things on current and pending support coverage. We've added a couple of new requirements to be addressed in current and pending support. We are fully aware that these are two concepts that you've seen before, because those are things that NIH currently asks. And we think this will be very helpful for not only our program staff, but reviewers to understand in terms of assessing duplication or overlap, what is a brief statement about what you're going to do on that project? And then finally, the potential overlap with any active or pending project or in-kind contribution and this proposal in terms of scope, budget, person months plan, or committed to the project by the individual. And then, as I've already mentioned in the bio sketch, we will be incorporated in this section, again, a reference to the new disclosure table. And again, I'm hoping that we receive clearance from OMB very shortly so that we can begin doing outreach well before when the PAP guide goes into effect, because I think this is information useful for you now. Next slide, please. I did want to briefly mention the fact that we did put into place on October 5th, 2020, we modified our award terms and conditions to require the AOR to notify NSF if the organization discovers that a PI or co-PI on an active NSF award failed to disclose current support or in-kind contribution information as part of the proposal submission process. Organizations do have 30 calendar days to submit the undisclosed current support or in-kind contribution, or if there is a challenge, you still submit the notification and you let us know that those issues are appearing. The information, we did not in the past have a way for you to submit this, but we have identified our other request notification in the notification and request module in research.gov as how you will do that. NSF may consult with the AOR or designee if necessary to determine what is the impact of the new information on the NSF funded grant, and where necessary, take appropriate action. And for those of you who are saying, I'm sure nobody's even submitted these, yes, they have. And we often have to have a discussion with the institution to find out more, or to have a discussion about how to best proceed with that information. Next slide, please. We also, starting October 5th, 2020, modified our annual project report format to require PIs and co-PIs to notify NSF when active other support has changed since the award was made or since submission of the most recent annual report. This is not an NSF only type of disclosure. This requirement is included in the NSTC approved research project report format. And if you to submit that information, it must be submitted using an NSF approved format for current and pending support to update that information in your project report. And with that, that completes my part of the presentation. And so I will turn it over to Michelle Bowles at NIH.
Thank you so much, Jean and Rebecca. Next slide. So our overview really is to talk about, and some of this is probably very similar to what NSF has talked about. And so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time going through a recap of what they've said, but I will be talking about the NIH perspective, which is very similar to our colleagues within the NSF and others across the federal research platform. But the commitment transparency is important. And we have examples and our approach we want to share. And then, of course, talking about the recap of the forms and instruction updates. And then, of course, resources to help you navigate some of these changes to the instructions and the forms. Next slide. Next slide. Thank you. So we've talked about commitment transparency, and the real issue here is making sure that we have an open and transparent dialogue, both verbally and in writing, documenting where there are conflicts and where the appropriate disclosures need to be made. And the reason why we have come down this road is because there has been a failure by some researchers that are funded by NIH to disclose some substantial contributions and resources from other organizations, which has threatened the decisions that NIH has made to fund certain proposals. Not only has it threatened it, but it has distorted decisions. And so for us, we want to make sure that as we continue to partner with our research community, we want to partner both with the the recipients and the faculty and having us all on the same page, making sure that that transparency is clear and those disclosures are made appropriately. Next slide. So we have followed the OSTP Office of Science and Technology core values: open and transparency, accountability and honesty, impartiality and objectivity, respect, freedom from injury, and of course, merit-based competition. NIH prides itself on the NIH peer review merit competition system. And in order for us to make those decisions, we have to have those accountability and honesty and transparent discussions, no matter what that looks like. Next slide, please. The areas that we consistently find ourselves in, and we are very concerned, is about the researchers not providing and disclosing substantial contributions from other organizations, including foreign governments and businesses. We also find that there is a diversion of IP rights and the fact that they are not reported and that we cannot make decisions on funding proposals based on these kinds of lack of information and lack of transparency. And then, of course, the failure by some peer reviewers to keep information in grant applications confidential. This is something that we've prided ourselves on, saying that we have our peer reviewers signing conflict of interest disclosures. And of course, that information is being shared broadly and really tainting the integrity of our peer review system. Next slide. And so we've tried to give some examples. And the reason why we're trying to give some examples is because we're receiving a great number of questions about, if we talk to a researcher once or twice in China, do we have to report that? We want to make it very, very clear that we are not looking at minuscule kinds of conversations. We're looking at serious disclosures that must be outlined in some sort of employment agreement arrangements. And so here we are outlining giving you an example of the fact that the job objectives of this particular example during the employment period outlines scientific research objectives, and the laboratory in the United States will gradually move back to China to rebuild and provide the international cutting-edge translational medicine that will be carried out abroad. And so these are the kinds of things we're looking at. Next slide, please. Undisclosed employment agreements. Folks are really concerned about the fact that NIH is asking for copies of these agreements. But in these agreements, we identify time commitments. We identify substantial funding for research, including startup, laboratory equipment and personnel, in-kind contributions, signing bonuses, salaries, housing, and other benefits, and so forth. And this is where we are trying to make sure that this does not create a conflict of commitment, a conflict of interest, and making sure that we identify it, have that disclosed so that we can remove overlap, remove commitment overlap, and make sure that we are not paying for research in scientific areas multiple times. Next slide, please. So many institutions say that they're not aware. And so we talk about the fact that we are seeing talent programs, 1,000 talent programs and others, where additional funding, resources, and sources are provided and communicated to Dr. Lauer and others within the NIH. And when we talk about these issues, one of the things that we consistently hear is that the research institution may not know about this. And so the reason why we are trying to obtain copies of these 1,000 talent contracts and others, grants, agreements, contracts, whatever they look like, is because we feel that we are providing our institutions with an opportunity to obtain that information so that our institutions can make sound decisions as well as they're submitting applications. Because we partner with our institutions and we've been in partnership with them for many, many years. And we know that this is not the way that we want our research enterprise to fall. So when we ask for this information from our institutions, it's only to solidify the fact that all parties are understanding and knowing what is being done, and that information is being shared on a very broad and fully disclosed commitment basis. Next slide, please. We have at least 450 scientists, if not more than 200 institutions, many fields of biomedicine all over the United States. And the denials that we consistently hear and receive, despite the documentation, is, I allowed this person to use my name as the PI. I knew nothing about this grant. I didn't actually do the work. The affiliations were in error. And over and over and over again, we, along with our institutions, are finding that some of these areas are not true. And so where they're not true, we want to identify, expose, and then fix it. And where they are true, we want to be able to provide our researchers and your faculty members with the ability to share that information openly and in a transparent manner, so that there is no misgiving about what's being done at the recipient institution. Next slide. So our approach really is to utilize the J-Corps guidance and model that in a way that we believe is necessary and sufficient to our values, as well as to the J-Corps values. We have worked very closely with other research agencies to make sure that we align our values, so that as we go out, while NIH might be asking for different and other kinds of information, which our regulations allow for us to do, we want to make sure that we ask for that in a way that gives our recipients clear understanding of what we've always said. And I think Gene Feldman said it very nicely. We've always asked for full and open disclosure. All research activities meant all research activities. And so we want to make sure that we help our recipients understand what that really meant. And one of the things that I think has been very clear, at least to NIH, and specifically, I have to say from a personal perspective, personal professional perspective, really, is that some of these things have changed because times have changed and things have outlined and been enlightened to us that these are some of the challenges that we're facing in this day and age that we may not have been facing many, many years ago. And so when we identify challenges and we know that we are funding research over and over and over again, or we know that IP is going in a different direction outside of the United States that we have no control over, we have to do things differently. And so doing things differently means that we have to solidify, change instructions and change forms to capture these kinds of changes and these kinds of things that are happening over and over and over again. So forms are being updated for that very reason, and we need information to support sound funding decisions so that we don't taint the integrity of the NIH peer review system. Next slide. So the recap is the BioSketch format updates. We talked a little bit about this in an earlier session. We've updated titles. We are capturing scientific appointments, in all positions and scientific appointments, as well as making sure that we've removed certain sections that would cause confusions with duplication. That was absolutely in discussion and in concert with our colleagues and our friends at the NSF, raising to the attention that some of this information is very much the same and why are we capturing it? And NIH is very open to making sure that those duplications are eradicated. So that was a main reason for why we changed that. We agree then that appointments are current, domestic, foreign, outside of the academic appointment. And we also know that these are definitions that have been in place, and NIH has not changed that definition. We still outline the fact that the page limitations have not changed. Next slide, please. And the fact that updated information is in a more structured format. We want supporting documentation. As I talked about earlier, we need copies of the contracts, the grants, or other agreements. And the reason why we're asking for this is because we need additional information to continue to make sound funding decisions. We have not received that information in the past. And when we've asked for it, we've actually identified significant overlap. And so this is very much the reason why we're asking for that additional information here. We need to have immediate notification in the near future for undisclosed other support, so that we can continue to make continuing grants, funding grants on a continuation basis. I'm sorry, on a continuation basis, as well as new grants with the information we have at hand. Lots of times what has happened is we've identified the fact that there has been a significant change with these foreign talent contracts that we were not aware of in the past, became aware of now, and it has really tainted and made a different way forward in terms of continuation funding and new funding, and the way peer reviewers are reviewing our applications. And then, of course, we're asking for the electronic signature for certifying that the information that is submitted by the PI and senior key personnel is accurate and complete. Next slide. And so NIH continues to expect that recipients and applicants, of course, update that biosketch using the new application instructions for the format under applications just in time. And that will be for the receipt date of May 25th, 2021. That is the expectation. However, I want to make sure that folks understand that NIH will absolutely require the updated formatted pages, as we have outlined, for information that would be submitted on or after January 2022. The digital signatures are required, needs to be in a flat PDF, and we also have that requirement for January 25th, 2022. And then failure to do so will force NIH to consider withdrawing applications or delaying consideration for funding, and that's just not ideal for any of us. So we want to make sure that we give you what you need, and you give us what we need in order to move science forward. And then, of course, applicants and recipients will remain responsible for disclosing all research endeavors, regardless of the version of the forms used. And so to that point, where we expect for the applicants to use the updated biosketch format, if you don't use that format, you still need to disclose all of the information that we've asked for, and not necessarily in that format, but it needs to be provided so that we can make sound funding decisions, both in the new and the continuation funding. Next slide. And we're trying to provide resources, and so the next slide outlines that. Science CV and the additional resources updated. We've tried to outline, we've tried to give what would you call it, the inbox, the other support inbox, where the questions will be submitted both to our policy folks, our systems policy folks, ERA, and perhaps even some of our biosketch science CV areas. But I do want to make it very clear that that is a very collaborative effort. And so while the questions may be going to one inbox, it's being divvied up in a way that is a common sense approach in helping to identify what those needs are. And the real challenge for NIH at this point is we've received very interesting kinds of questions. As I mentioned before, we talked about, having questions asking whether or not talking to a Chinese affiliate is something that needs to be reported either once, or if they talk to the person once, or if they talk to them 3 or 4 times. And so we're trying to outline and make it very clear that the significant issues are surrounding these contracts that are not being disclosed. NIH is not interested in getting into the weeds of how many times someone talks to someone else. We want to make sure that key information that is provided to a researcher or key information that a researcher is conducting as a part of their research endeavors is outlined to us, and talking to someone once or twice is not what we're looking at. And so we want to not water that down. We want to build up the research enterprise and make sure that we protect ourselves and others. And so having that kind of discussion and providing these kinds of resources is the approach that NIH is looking to move forward in. Next slide. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Again, it is good to be here with you all today. I am going to try to just give you a really quick update on where things stand with the Department of Defense. And happy to take questions, happy to take answers. I just want to echo what Rebecca said a little bit ago about NSPM 33. We are working hard on moving out on NSPM 33, and as part of moving out on NSPM 33, we are trying to stay very much in lockstep with NSF and NIH, who really have the vast majority of the who've sort of set the stage, right, the research stage, and we want to make sure that while DoD has some specific things that they might need or want, that it is all within the context of what you already understand and already expect to do. So I'm happy to be here. I'm happy to talk with you a little bit today. I want to start by telling you that in the last NDAA, the last National Defense Authorization Act, they asked us to designate an academic liaison, and as luck would have it, that person is me. So I will be the academic liaison for the Department of Defense, which means that if you have questions about the department and research security or foreign and improper influence, you can reach out to my office and we will work to get you an answer. So I guess they decided that we were too haphazard, and so they wanted to have a belly button, which, you know, we were already doing a pretty good job of internally coordinating, but I guess they wanted a named official, and that will be me. But as with many things in the department, they don't call the Pentagon the Puzzle Palace for nothing, right? As with many things in the department, we will be supported by lots and lots of other offices and other components as we come up with this, with what we are proposing to do and what we plan to do. I work with a lot with my colleagues in the Strategic Technology Protection and Exploitation Office, as well as the research leaders in the DoD components. That unfortunately makes a question like, so what's the DoD doing? Kind of difficult at times because we are very much a confederated entity. Because various parts of the DoD may be doing different things. I do ask that if you have worries that they are not in line with the directions that are sort of are being set by the sort of interagency, that you let me know, and we will work on clarifications and on trying to get us all to sing from the same choir book. My office is looking to work with the rest of the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Research and Engineering to create some of the overarching policy goals for services and components, and then implementation of those policies will be done at the component level. So what that means is, we will say, this is what NSPM 33 says. You need to have a COI policy and a conflict of interest and a conflict of commitment management policy that has these characteristics, and this is how we propose that you should do it. And then how the Navy implements it might look a little different than how the Air Force implements it, which may look a little different than how the CDMRP program might implement it. But fundamentally, they will be following the same general policy guidance. The specific implementation within their service might look different. However, hopefully, externally speaking to you, they will look the same, because what we will be asking of you and what we will be, how we will be managing things ought to be very similar across DoD. For example, department is implementing COI and COC policies like other agencies have. We have taken our definitions for conflicts straight from the NSPM, and we are sort of internally coordinating policies that will look very much like what you see from the NSF or the NIH, because that is the goal here. Because again, the goal is harmonization, and we are going to do our best to participate in that activity. I hope to share more about these policies soon. So you send us information, and then what do we do with it, right? And this is the question you've been asking us, and you've been asking all of us over and again. So that comes down to where we are looking at what we call a risk framework. We're looking at risks to research, both from a programmatic perspective and an institution and personnel perspective. Lower risks are associated with fundamental research and domestic researchers. Higher risk would be associated with more advanced research, or something that might be what we would call controlled unclassified information research, or on the programmatic side. So for the personnel side, higher risk could be us discovering that a researcher had connections with international programs or institutions that they had not reported to us, particularly if that international program or institution is one that is known to be of concern. This does not mean, and I want to be clear, this does not mean that if you have worked with China, for example, that we will not fund you. I know that sometimes people get that in their head, and that is just not really what certainly I am saying, and I do not believe that's what anybody else is saying. It does mean that your researchers need to make sure they're thorough in their disclosure forms and really take that seriously, because part of our risk framework implementation will involve some kind of checking, and we don't know how many or what we are doing the checking on, and in some places they're already being checked. We intend for risk reviews to be done quickly, so that we do not slow down the pace of making awards. So I don't think that that is the plan at all. There is no intention for making these risk assessments mean that it takes longer to award a DoD grant. And that is something that I will personally be watching for and watching over as we implement policies. We also, and this is important, we also do not intend to have a security veto over research. We want the research funding decisions to be made by the experts, either at the program manager level or in cases where we think that there's a higher risk, up at the next level in the research leadership chain. We intend for the risk reviews to inform research decisions, but still for the ultimate decision to be made by our experts. This is all still in development, and I'll be in touch with you more as we develop these plans. But, unlike Rebecca, who's promised like 100% transparency, I am going to be somewhat limited in what I can say about what criteria we use as people are making decisions, because that is very much part of it has always been part of the DoD special sauce, and it will continue to be part of the DoD special sauce, and how we incorporate the risk framework into our decision processes, I'm not sure will be publicly available. However, that being said, what is going to be required from your researchers and from your institutions, and the policies, the COI and COC policies of the institutions, we are following the federal model. There is nothing special that we are doing. There is nothing different that we are asking for. What we are saying is how we evaluate that information and evaluate that data against a risk framework. What I can tell you is the intention is for the science to still drive us and to continue to drive us. It will always drive us. But the sort of nuts and bolts of how program managers make decisions has always been confusing to people, and it will continue to be confusing, is really what I'm trying to tell you. We should be able to message very clearly, though. So we can't give you like examples of how we go through this. But what we will do is tell you the types of activities we see as problematic to inform the community better. And I will be engaging with your institutions more to help get that message out. Again, there should be no surprises. Michelle showed you some of the contract language that is concerning. Rebecca has talked at length, as has Jean, about the types of things that we have that the federal funding ecosystem is worried about, and the DoD's concerns are really no different than that. So I will be able to tell you the types of activities we see as problematic. Again, in concert with the interagency, I don't think you're going to see a whole lot from us about the actual risk framework that the DoD is using. NSPM implementation. So other parts of the NSPM still working on, and as Rebecca very appropriately put it, it is going to be implemented slowly, and it is going to be implemented in a thoughtful way, with, hand in hand with like all of our other federal funding partners, because again, we hear you about the frustrations you have with harmonization, and we want to do everything we can. I know that the working group that Jean and Michelle are leading, looking at implementing this in as common a way as we can across the interagency is certainly something that we are highly supportive of, and we thank them for being so far ahead in articulating their policy so that we can work from what they already have. There are pieces that we haven't yet figured out. I'll be candid with you, and Rebecca, I think, alluded to the digital persistent identifiers for researchers. We're still trying to figure out how we're going to make that work. We don't know what that path forward is at this point, and we will be working with the interagency again to discuss it with them before moving ahead, as an example. So I guess my main messages to you are, we are taking it seriously to make our policies as consistent with other agencies as possible. We are centralizing policymaking within the Department of Defense in my office in terms of how we are going to implement policy on foreign influence and foreign interference. However, the implementation of that policy will continue to happen at the component level, like it has and does with every single piece of policy that we participate in and write for the department. And with that, I will yield back over to Pamela and Jim. Thank you for inviting me.
Thanks so much, Bindu. Really appreciate everything. Well, you all have generated a huge amount of questions, huge number of questions, more than 30. We won't be able to get to all of those live in the 15 minutes we have remaining, but we will try to work with you to get answers that we can share out with everybody after the session. But I will start with we're seeing some patterns of questions. And so let me start with the ones that seem to be most common that we're seeing. And Michelle, you get to be the lucky recipient of the first one. And it really, of course,
is it the first one or all 100 of them?
No, no, but if there were a prize for the most related, I think NIH.
Oh my goodness.
Okay. But the not going to be a huge surprise, right? It's the topic of other support and what to report and when. So I'm going to break this apart into pieces because people were asking different parts. So the first part is simply confirming that the requirement to attach supporting documents to other support is mandatory beginning January 2022, but recommended starting now. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. So that means that for example, translated documents, if you didn't have them today, it's okay, because you would attach them for sure starting in January.
The expectation is that you have them when you submit it. If you don't, we will provide some leniency.
Okay, got it. So the next question kind of related to this is, there seems to be still confusion about what exactly gets attached as supporting documentation. So it looks clear that if you have a foreign appointment, an appointment with a foreign entity, you would need to upload copies of your appointment letter or other agreement that you had relative to that appointment. Is that correct?
Yes, those are the instructions.
Yes. So I'm just going through one by one because people have all these, right? So, and they don't
Nope,
seem clear. So I just thought it will clarify,
Nope,
right?
Dale, I got you.
Okay. The next one is, if you have employment with a foreign entity and you have an employment contract, you would be expected to upload that document or anything related to it, correct?
The foreign contract needs to be provided and the appointment needs to be stated.
Okay. Okay. So any kind of employment that you would have with a foreign entity, whatever that employment arrangement looks like, whether
The
it's an
employment arrangement is related to the your other support, and it supports the research endeavors, as we've always talked about, it needs to be provided. It needs to be disclosed.
Okay. So the next
Bindu, I need you to write this stuff down, Bindu, because at some point we're gonna pivot to you.
Okay. So so then we have the foreign contracts and grants as supporting documentation. And the understanding that we have there is that you are reporting and uploading all foreign, well, let me not say reporting, let's say uploading as supporting documents, any foreign grants or contracts that you have received from that foreign entity as a part of your employment or appointment with them. Correct?
Yes, correct.
Does it matter whether those grants or contracts are teaching related or whether they're research related?
Research endeavors. And so
Research
it should,
endeavors.
yes.
Okay.
Yep.
So if you have a foreign grant or contract.
Can I just
Sure,
jump
go
in and
ahead.
say too, if
No,
in
please.
fact, when in doubt, the thing that I always try to tell folks is, feel free to pick up the phone often and early, right? And because we really are talking about research endeavors. And so unless the institution or the recipient considers teaching research endeavors,
right,
then, we would defer to that.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay. And if they do have questions, Michelle, do you want them calling their grants management specialist or the policy office?
So if it's really to understand the overarching policy, they should probably contact, we have a specific other support inbox that we need. And I know that Kristen Ta is on, but she's as a participant. But maybe Kristen, if you can write in the comments or in the chat what that inbox is, that would be very helpful.
Okay.
Because obviously, if it comes in and there's a question about the form and the instructions, I want to make sure that my other team, the other side of the team, the systems policy branch folks that do the others that revises the other support forms and gives the instructions, have the opportunity to review it. And it might not really be a policy question. So we're trying to share the wealth here.
Okay, that sounds good. And then the last
Michelle,
part that's associated.
Could I do a
with
little
this-
follow-up?
Hang on, just 1 second, Jim,
Okay,
because I just need to finish one more element of it. Okay, and then I'll go right to you.
Sure.
Is there are obviously foreign contracts and grants that the institution receives, And those, of course, would be reported for the investigator's research is what I'm talking about. And those would be reported on other support, but those are ones that are running through the institution. Do copies of those foreign contracts and grants also need to be uploaded as supporting documentation, in addition to the ones that might be affiliated with those actual foreign employment agreements?
No, that is not what NIH is saying. And if that's something that we need to make clear, Kristen, we should probably go ahead and develop an FAQ that makes that very clear for our recipients, because that would be a lot.
That would be a lot, right? And I think a number of us kind of knew from previous conversations that that wasn't where you were intending.
No.
But I'm seeing enough questions coming through even today that I think that might be very helpful if you could put out an FAQ on that.
So we will absolutely take that down. I know that I have several staff that may be listening in here. Between Kristen and Avery and Chris Moore, we'll get it down for you guys. And then Pam, of course, you'll make sure that we see some of these questions and we can help answer.
Yes, of course. Yes, Jim and I will definitely do that. Kristen, we're going to move to Jim in a second here, but I think you've been made a panelist. Do you want to share with us information about that mailbox?
Yes, so I did also put it in the chat. It's NIH OS BioSketch at NIH.gov. And so we have folks from all of our different divisions who are able to go in and answer questions there from systems, compliance, policy. So.
Okay, great. Jim, what was
Kristen said that she thought that this was really for me. She says, now I'm a panelist. It's like, look, it's like Rebecca and Jean. We're sharing the wealth. Don't drop off.
Don't drop off, yeah.
Share that wealth, Michelle.
So,
Michelle, this is a follow-up. This is a follow-up to some of the things that Pamela has been saying, but really probably applies to everything. I mean, the spirit of what all three of your agencies have been saying is that this is about identifying the potential for improper influence and overlap. Right. So if there's potential budgetary commitment or scientific overlap, if there's potential for a relationship that might look like it's improper influence or something like that, you want to know about it. Is that a general statement?
Spot on.
So, okay. Because that rules out things like internal grants, right? Because you already know about those things.
That's right.
That rules out things that aren't research endeavors, because if they truly aren't research endeavors, then they cannot create overlap. They could create commitment issues, but yeah. Okay.
Oh, Jim, actually, that's really a good point.
Yeah.
And maybe we should update FAQs to make sure that we highlight that point, Kristen. Jim, can you say that again?
Sure. I mean,
just as eloquently as you said it the first time.
I'll try. It is being recorded, so we can check the quality of the two.
Absolutely.
The two,
you know,
versions.
I'm going to check you. I'm going to fact check you.
I know you are. But I think what I tried to say is this is about confirming the validity of two things: that there isn't any improper influence, and that there isn't any overlap or capacity issues related to overlap of science, overlap of money, overlap of science, and that we don't have a relationship that could optically look like it's improper influence, right? There's a publication that I'm collaborating with somebody that you want to know about. So if it's potentially any of those things, we should be transparent. And therefore, by definition, if it's an academic appointment where I'm just teaching, then it's not related to my research endeavors, and it can't create overlap of science or in budget by definition.
Yes, Jim. I'm telling you, you hit the nail on the head.
Okay. So
there is a question. Okay, go ahead.
Oh,
there was one related to NSF I was going to say briefly. And okay. There's one related to any effort not indicated in the budget should be included in the facilities and other resources not in the current and pending. So there's a question about where certain things are included from the standpoint of facilities and other resources and current and pending. I think you've mentioned this before, Jean.
Yeah, so there's, I think, just a general confusion here then, because what we're saying is the person's time is put on how much money they want from NSF, put on the budget. What current facilities, equipment, and other resources, if they're not asking for any money, the purpose of facilities, equipment, and other resources is to provide an aggregated description of the internal and external resources, including personnel, that the organization and its collaborators will provide to the project should it be funded. There's no ambiguity there. The piece about current and pending support, though, is current and pending support is also provided for this project. So you've got to have it in two places if it is indeed a person's time and not an in-kind contribution. That's exactly what the PAC guide says now and has said it for a long time. There's also an associated piece about someone said, well, if they put the time or what they're doing on the project in facilities, equipment, and other resources, what happens to NSF's cost sharing policy and the prohibition against voluntary committed cost sharing? That too is a little bit of a misunderstanding of 2 CFR 200. To be voluntary committed cost sharing, it has to be on the budget. Facilities, equipment, and other resources is not considered voluntary committed cost sharing. So that's I gave you a twofer and I answered both questions in one time.
And now you're going to get a commendation to add to that, Jean, because I'm pretty sure that every single person on this webinar would join Jim and me in saying thank you for your plans to issue this disclosure table. Because that is just going to really help us be able to quickly and accurately have a reference tool, but also as an educational tool for our faculty and our departmental research administrators as they navigate these waters. So that when you're able to share that and release it, thank you so much for doing that. So I want to make sure.
I think it's really just important because I know we're running out of time, but it was through the many discussions with FDP, with COGR, with the committee, the FIG. I'm sorry, that's just not rolling off. That made it
an influence working group. What are you going to do with it?
It made it possible because it was that back and forth dialogue, and we also would definitely hear where are the pain spots. Things like consulting, and yes, a little tease. We've addressed consulting in a different way on that table. So we're very excited, trust me, to be able to share it with you as well.
Okay. We are out of time, but I am going to take the liberty of asking one last question for Rebecca or Bindu to answer, because this we saw several times in the questions as well. And that is, what is the best resource out there to track down foreign talent recruitment programs?
You know, Bindu, I put in the chat a link to some copies of these contracts. And the challenge with resources is that the websites that used to list these programs, they used to exist, they've all gone away. The websites have all gone away. Now that is very concerning and telling because that's a lack of transparency in and of itself. And the names of the programs are constantly changing. So all we can do is go by what the criteria and characteristics are of these foreign government talent recruitment programs that we're concerned about. And we're concerned about ones that have these contracts with terms and conditions that are similar to what you see in what I sent to you. We do have a definition that's in the NSPM that people can go by.
Okay, thank you. Bindu, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I'll just add that the NSPM definition is very broad. If you read the NSPM definition, we purposely made that a catch-all for all kinds of, because people can, foreign governments try to engage with the research enterprise for both positive and nefarious purposes. And so the NSPM definition is very broad about what a foreign talent research program is. And the reason it's so broad is that when we try to narrow it to just the malicious actors, it got very complicated very, very fast, and it is not something that is easily shareable. But what we are trying to do is share the characteristics, as Rebecca said, right? Like if you have a contract that looks like this, if you are being asked to hide something, if you are asked to not share something, questions about, here is a contract that I have entered into that I cannot share with either my institution or a federal funding partner, right? Like those are the kind of things that are the red flags and that we would worry about. So I guess the policies of the individual universities has to be to understand where the support for their faculty come from, right? For their principal, for their investigators come from. And then we expect you to share with us the pieces of it that we're asking for.
Thank you. I know we're out of time, so I want to thank all of you. Jim and I both thank all of you so much for both the wonderful comments, but also the great answers that you've had to our questions and the answers that you will be giving to our questions as well when we share the rest of the 30-odd questions with you. Your input, your partnership, your support is so valuable, and by doing this together, we're just obviously getting it better together and still addressing such an important and key need for the research enterprise. Jim, did you have any final remarks you wanted to add?
Nope. Well said.
Okay.
Thanks to everybody.
Thanks
Thank you.
so much. Okay, bye.
Thanks.